Every time you used to fill up your tank with gasoline, a few cents of every dollar spent would trickle down to a country many Americans couldn't find on a map: Venezuela. In fact, almost every aspect of your daily life has been dominated by Venezuelan petroleum. The asphalt used to build highways, the rubber for your car tires, the plastics in your computer and smartphone, your shoes, televisions, shampoo, and furniture. The list goes on, touching virtually every manufactured product in the modern economy. And it's this fundamental dependence on oil that has created what Venezuela now possesses, the strangest economy on Earth. In many aspects, Venezuela and its population seem to defy basic economic logic, creating paradoxes that would be impossible to believe if they weren't thoroughly documented. That same $50 tank of gasoline that costs you significant earnings is essentially given away for free to Venezuelan citizens, subsidized so heavily by government oil revenues that it costs less than bottled water. The people who inhabit sprawling slums around Caracas often can't find basic necessities like food, toilet paper, and medicine, yet virtually all have satellite television and smartphones. Even more bizarre, many families living in poverty will take out loans specifically to give their teenage daughters expensive cosmetic surgery, viewing physical beauty as a more reliable investment than education or business ventures. In 2010, an ordinary Venezuelan could fly to Paris, exchange currency at the artificial official rate, then return with 7 years' worth of minimum wage salary. People rarely save money, instead spending earnings immediately because inflation makes holding cash equivalent to watching wealth evaporate in real time. Glitzy hotels can simultaneously be either the most expensive in the world or surprisingly affordable, depending on which exchange rate you access. Venezuela boasts the world's largest proven oil reserves. Yet in 2017, the average citizen lost 8.7 kilograms due to food shortages. The nation produces almost nothing it consumes, importing everything from food to medicine, using precious foreign currency the government struggles to obtain. Most shocking of all, Venezuela was once the fourth richest country on Earth, significantly wealthier than the United Kingdom. Yet today, it's the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. This incredibly rich, strange, and tragic economic story has a single root cause: vast oil supplies and the corrupting effect of easy petroleum wealth on every leader who has controlled the country over the past century. Here at Economic Rewind, we've studied how natural resource wealth can become a curse rather than blessing, and Venezuela represents perhaps the most extreme example of how oil can destroy rather than build prosperity. This is the story of Venezuela, the strangest economy on Earth, and the worst economic disaster in modern history, illustrating how abundant natural resources can become a trap that prevents rather than enables long-term prosperity. On July 31st, 1914, life in Venezuela was forever changed when thick black liquid erupted from a 400-foot deep hole, marking the country's first successful commercial oil well and beginning an economic transformation that would reshape an entire continent. At this pivotal moment, Venezuela was nothing more than a backwater, obscure Andean country ruled by strongman Juan Vicente Gómez, a cunning dictator who never let any opportunity for personal enrichment pass without exploitation. Gómez had risen to power in 1908 through a classic military coup, seizing the presidency when his predecessor was conveniently absent in Paris, being treated for syphilis. From that moment until his death nearly 3 decades later, Gómez operated as absolute dictator, controlling every aspect of Venezuelan political and economic life. The discovery of what would prove to be an ocean of high-quality crude oil was, for Gómez, simply another opportunity to consolidate power and accumulate wealth. Lacking necessary capital, technical knowledge, and skilled workforce needed to develop a petroleum industry, Gómez made a fateful decision that would determine Venezuela's economic structure for the next century. He granted generous concessions to foreign oil companies, primarily from the United States and Britain, allowing them to explore, drill, and extract Venezuelan oil with essentially no taxes, no royalties, and minimal oversight, so long as these companies helped prop up his dictatorship through direct financial support. Gómez systematically granted oil exploration rights as personal favors to cronies, built an extensive network of loyalists financially dependent on oil revenues, and used petroleum income to create the country's first professional military, designed to protect his regime. Over the next 21 years, Venezuela transformed from an obscure agricultural country into the second largest oil producer on Earth, fundamentally altering global energy markets and establishing patterns of economic dependence that persist today. As oil production expanded rapidly, Venezuela became dangerously addicted to petroleum revenues, which supplied 2/3 of government income and over 90% of export earnings, making the economy extremely vulnerable to global oil price fluctuation. While Gómez and his circle enriched themselves first, ordinary Venezuelans also got their first taste of what a dictator flush with oil money could accomplish. The country's first modern banks opened, and the petroleum industry began paying incredibly high wages, creating a service economy around high-spending oil workers. Venezuelan farmers began abandoning ancestral agricultural lands, instead migrating to rapidly growing cities like Caracas to seek employment in oil industry or supporting services, fundamentally altering the country's demographic and economic structure. The timing created what economists recognize as a perfect storm. As global oil demand increased throughout the early 20th century, driven by automobile revolution and industrial expansion, demand for Venezuela's currency, the bolivar, increased correspondingly. This currency appreciation had two crucial effects that would shape development for the entire following century. First, it made importing foreign manufactured goods much cheaper for Venezuelan consumers. Second, it made exporting any Venezuelan products other than oil significantly more expensive and less competitive internationally. Venezuelan producers found they couldn't export anything competitively, while consumers realized buying foreign imports was almost always the cheapest option for everything from food to clothing to machinery. At precisely the same time, the world was experiencing the Great Depression, and the United States had allowed the dollar to weaken significantly against other currencies. In just one decade, the bolivar increased by 70% against major international currencies, making it one of the strongest currencies on the planet. For the first time, ordinary Venezuelans began importing luxury goods, landing decent-paying jobs in expanding service sectors, and gaining access to modern amenities like electricity and motorized transportation previously available only to wealthy elites. But Venezuelan society was simultaneously slipping into overwhelming reliance on oil revenues. By the late 1930s, virtually all business costs, wage levels, and consumer prices had become directly linked to the artificially overvalued currency. With huge influx of rural migrants moving to expanding cities, urban living costs reached levels that startled international observers, including President Franklin Roosevelt, who reportedly insisted initial reports about Venezuelan costs be double-checked because they seemed impossibly high. By 1939, Caracas had become the most expensive city to live in anywhere in the world, with basic goods costing more than in New York, London, or Paris, creating an economy that resembled a remote mining boomtown rather than sustainable national economy. Gómez ruled Venezuela as his personal fiefdom until his death in 1935, becoming one of the richest men in Latin America through oil revenues and monopolistic business practices. His passing inadvertently transformed the Venezuelan government into a major business enterprise when authorities took control of his vast industrial holdings. More importantly, Gómez's legacy was establishing a governing style combining personal enrichment, oil-dependent patronage networks, and authoritarian control, a model adopted by every subsequent Venezuelan leader, regardless of stated political ideology. The Second World War provided Venezuela's next president, Isaías Medina, with an opportunity to renegotiate the country's relationship with foreign oil companies from a position of strength, as Venezuelan oil had become essential to the Allied war effort. Medina wrote directly to President Roosevelt, requesting assistance in restructuring Venezuela's oil arrangements to provide greater benefits to Venezuelan people. With Mexico having recently nationalized its oil industry, Roosevelt agreed to provide support and sent legal advisors to help Venezuelan negotiations. This cooperation culminated in the revolutionary new oil law of 1943, called the 50-50 principle, making the Venezuelan state an equal partner in the petroleum industry, entitled to receive exactly half of all oil profits generated within the country. However, there was one significant problem. Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, a prominent Venezuelan economist, discovered, after analyzing the numbers, that this 50-50 split actually made Venezuelan oil less profitable compared to Middle Eastern petroleum production. Rather than accepting this disadvantage, Venezuela made a strategically brilliant decision. the country sent a diplomatic delegation to the Middle East, carrying translated versions of Venezuela's 50-50 legislation, essentially sharing their negotiating strategy with other oil-producing nations. Soon after these missions, Middle Eastern nations including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran adopted similar 50-50 laws, which made Venezuelan oil competitively profitable again, while simultaneously increasing revenues for oil producers worldwide. But Venezuela was unprepared for dramatic changes that would transform global energy markets in the post-war decade. Following World War II, there was massive increase in petroleum demand, driven by rapid economic growth, automobile expansion, petrochemical industry development, and increasing oil use for electricity and industrial production. Simultaneously, the Middle East erupted into geopolitical conflicts disrupting petroleum production, including Egyptian Suez Canal nationalization, Iranian oil crisis, and Arab-Israeli conflicts threatening energy security. Venezuela found itself perfectly positioned to benefit from these disruptions, possessing enormous reserves, political stability relative to the Middle East, and proximity to major North and South American consumer markets. During the golden period of the 50s and early 60s, Venezuela became almost unimaginably prosperous. Oil revenues flowed into government coffers at unprecedented rates, funding massive infrastructure projects, generous social programs, and development initiatives that transformed the country's landscape and social structure. Venezuelan cities, particularly Caracas, became showcases of modern architecture and urban planning, with futuristic skyscrapers, wide boulevards, modern shopping centers, and suburban developments rivaling anything in North America or Europe. The country developed sophisticated universities, world-class hospitals, modern highways and airports, and established a rapidly growing middle class, enjoying consumer lifestyles that were the envy of the developing world. During this period, Venezuelans could afford international travel, imported luxury goods, American automobiles, and air-conditioned comfort, while many citizens of supposedly developed countries still lacked basic amenities. But this unprecedented prosperity contained seeds of future disaster. The economy became even more oil-dependent, while other productive sectors continued declining due to overvalued currency and easy import policy. Venezuelan agriculture virtually disappeared as farmers abandoned land for higher-paying urban jobs, and the country became dependent on imported food. Manufacturing industries never developed because imports were always cheaper than domestic production. Most critically, Venezuelan leaders failed to save any meaningful portion of oil windfall for future needs, instead spending virtually every dollar on current consumption, social programs, and politically motivated projects providing immediate benefits but building no lasting economic foundation. Have you ever wondered how a country with the world's largest oil reserves could end up unable to feed its own population? Venezuela's experience shows how resource wealth can destroy rather than create prosperity when managed poorly. The decades following Venezuela's oil boom saw the country trapped in repetitive boom-bust cycles, directly corresponding to global petroleum price fluctuations, creating an increasingly unstable economy, unable to provide consistent prosperity. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, Venezuela experienced its first taste of economic devastation, accompanying heavy commodity dependence. The government devalued the bolivar dramatically. Inflation skyrocketed beyond 100% annually, and living standards plummeted as imported goods became unaffordable. The political establishment proved completely incapable of managing crisis, responding with failed policies including currency controls, price controls, and corrupt exchange mechanisms that enriched connected elites while impoverishing the general population. By the 90s, Venezuelan society had become thoroughly disillusioned with democratic governance, as traditional parties were viewed as corrupt, incompetent, and primarily interested in self-enrichment rather than solving mounting problems. During this crisis, charismatic military officer Hugo Chávez emerged as a political force, initially through a failed military coup in February 1992 that, despite failure, made him a hero to poor Venezuelans who saw him as representing anti-corruption sentiment and revolutionary change. The coup didn't succeed, and Chavez was imprisoned. However, to Venezuela's impoverished masses, he had become a symbol of hope against the corrupt establishment that had failed them repeatedly. Under pressure from supporters, the next president released Chavez from prison, allowing him to build a political movement that would eventually transform Venezuela in unimaginable ways. Over the next 6 years, Venezuela's economic turmoil worsened dramatically. Due to inadequate banking regulations and widespread corruption, a massive financial crisis occurred, in which 11% of the country's entire GDP was wiped out in a single banking collapse, while inflation again topped 100%. The demand for political change enabled Chavez to become a rising political star, presenting himself as the only leader capable of breaking with failed past policies and implementing genuine reforms benefiting ordinary citizens rather than wealthy elites. Chavez was elected president in 1998 on an explicit mandate to completely restructure Venezuelan society and fix what he characterized as decades of systematic corruption, inequality, and economic mismanagement. Born into rural poverty, Chavez had risen through military ranks during campaigns against leftist guerrillas in the 70s. However, during his military career, he had developed leftist sympathies and created a secret organization with other officers who believed Venezuela needed complete socialist transformation. By Chavez's election, almost half of Venezuelans were living in poverty. Despite enormous oil wealth, corruption was endemic throughout government institutions, and inequality had reached levels greater than any previous point in Venezuelan history. Chavez claimed to believe in democratic principles and initially promised to respect private property while implementing reforms to reduce corruption and inequality. However, he had developed close relationships with Cuban dictator Fidel Castro and had become an admirer of Cuba's socialist system. Desperate for fundamental change from failed previous policies, Venezuelan voters gave Chavez unprecedented authority to rewrite the national constitution, creating a new Congress filled with his allies and establishing legal foundation for what he called the Bolivarian Revolution. In 2001, Chavez enacted 49 new laws, dramatically expanding state power, giving government authority to seize private land and break up large agricultural properties, while implementing new petroleum laws, setting the stage for greater state control over oil industry. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, while technically government-owned, had been operating largely independently of political control, functioning essentially as a private corporation that happened to be state-owned rather than shareholder-owned. PDVSA's independence and professional management had made it a well-functioning, profitable corporation that actively minimized tax payments to government while maximizing reinvestment in exploration. Chavez fundamentally disagreed with this approach and viewed PDVSA's independence as an obstacle to his socialist transformation. He began appointing political loyalists to the company's board, including many individuals with no petroleum industry experience. When PDVSA employees protested this government intrusion, their resistance culminated in a brief military coup, temporarily removing Chavez in April 2002, though he was restored just 2 days later. Thousands of PDVSA employees then declared total strike in December 2002, completely halting oil production for 2 months and costing billions in lost revenue during what became known as the oil strike. Rather than compromise, Chavez responded by doubling down. He fired almost 20,000 PDVSA employees, including most experienced engineers, geologists, and technical specialists, and publicly labeled them enemies of the Venezuelan people. The mass firing of PDVSA's experienced workforce marked a turning point in Venezuela's trajectory, as loss of technical expertise severely damaged the country's ability to maintain efficient oil production while eliminating the last source of independent economic analysis within government structure. Panicked by dramatic oil export slowdown and political instability, ordinary Venezuelans sought to protect savings by converting bolivars into more stable foreign currencies like dollars and euros. Chavez responded to this capital flight by reinstituting comprehensive exchange controls and creating Khedive, remarkably similar to the corrupt Riccati system that had enriched elites during the 80s crisis. To combat rising inflation from his monetary policies, Chavez implemented widespread price controls on basic goods and forced banks to provide cheap loans to politically favored industries and consumers, creating the same distorted incentives that had failed repeatedly in Venezuela's past. Once again, with high inflation making cash worthless and artificially cheap credit available, Venezuelans adapted by taking out maximum loans and spending money immediately, further accelerating inflationary pressures. But unlike previous economic disasters, this situation temporarily stabilized due to extraordinary luck unrelated to Chavez's policies. Global oil prices began rising dramatically in the early 2000s, as rapidly developing countries like China and India demanded enormous quantities of commodities. By 2008, oil prices had increased by 600% from late 90s lows, generating massive windfall revenues for oil producers worldwide, and temporarily masking fundamental economic problems that Chavez's policies were creating. The crucial lessons of previous boom-bust cycles were either deliberately ignored or forgotten by Chavez and his advisors. Instead of saving excess oil revenues in sovereign wealth funds for inevitable price declines, Chavez used the booming market to finance incredibly ambitious socialist agenda. He instituted massive social programs called missions, subsidizing food, housing, healthcare, and employment for poor Venezuelans, while importing thousands of doctors from Cuba to provide free medical services in slum areas. The overvalued currency made imports incredibly cheap once again, and oil money flowed through the economy at unprecedented rates, creating temporary prosperity that convinced many Venezuelans that Chavez's socialist policies were responsible for improved living standards. For ordinary Venezuelans who had lived through decades of instability, all they knew was that quality of life had dramatically improved under Chavez's leadership, as they could again afford luxury consumer goods, imported cars, and fill gas tanks with pocket change. But Chavez continued pursuing his 21st century socialism, systematically nationalizing major industries and dramatically increasing taxes on foreign companies operating in Venezuela. He declared explicit economic war against what he termed savage neoliberal capitalists, arguing that Venezuela's historical problems had never been caused by oil revenue mismanagement, but by exploitation by evil foreign capitalists. According to Chavez's worldview, inflation was not a basic economic principle related to money supply and fiscal policy, but rather an attack by enemies seeking to extract wealth from Venezuelan people through market manipulation. By Chavez's death in 2013, Venezuela maintained the highest percentage of oil revenue extraction by any government worldwide, with approximately 90% of profit from every barrel flowing directly to state coffers rather than private companies. How Venezuela chose to spend this enormous wealth was entirely the government's decision, with no interference from foreign oil companies, making it impossible to blame external actors for mounting economic problems. The booming economy under Chavez, like prosperity under all previous leaders, was never about their specific policies. It was simply a reflection of current global oil prices and Venezuela's ability to extract and sell petroleum internationally. Crucially, Chavez chose not to save any meaningful portion of oil revenue windfall. Instead, he continued creating bloated, inefficient government-owned companies, failed to invest in productivity-boosting policies, and saw agricultural revitalization goals end in complete failure. His dollar flow restrictions enabled extensive black market currency trading, creating bizarre distortions. Foreign tourists discovered that buying bolivars at official rates made hotels cost over $2,000 nightly, but accessing black market rates could reduce costs to $50. To allow international travel, citizens could exchange bolivars for $2,000 annually at subsidized official rates. Once overseas, many Venezuelans kept unspent foreign currency and smuggled the rest back to sell on black markets, making 7 times annual minimum wage through single trips. Having lived for generations in such economically distorted environment, Venezuelans developed completely warped understanding of money, economics, and rational financial behavior. With inflation reaching 100, 300, and eventually 10,000% annually, Venezuelans learned to quickly take out loans and purchase anything available, because by payment due dates, required payments represented tiny fractions of original value due to currency devaluation. When food became scarce due to price controls and import restrictions, Venezuelans bought satellite televisions and electronics instead. When those luxury goods were unavailable, many turned to cosmetic surgery and beauty treatments. In an economy where money becomes valueless, looking beautiful became rational investment strategy. But then, inevitable crisis arrived. In 2008, oil prices dipped significantly, then completely plummeted in 2014, leaving Venezuela unable to import food, medicine, and essential resources the country no longer produced domestically. Unlike countries such as Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Norway, Venezuela had not saved any meaningful portion of oil windfall during boom years. Its economy had not been diversified to support productive industries, and the country could no longer grow enough food to feed its population. Venezuela's economy completely collapsed under accumulated distortions and dependencies. Millions fled the country, seeking economic opportunity and survival in neighboring nations, while those remaining faced starvation, hyperinflation, and complete social breakdown. By 2019, inflation reached astronomical 65,000% annually. To put this in perspective, Americans today worry about inflation rates of 5 to 8%. while Venezuelans were experiencing price increases that made money essentially worthless within months. Chavez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, currently leads what remains of the Venezuelan state, continuing basic Chavez principles while slowly dismantling remaining democratic institutions and constitutional governance. Meanwhile, Venezuelan people are suffering more extreme poverty and deprivation than they experienced even before oil discovery, over a century ago, demonstrating that having abundant natural resources without competent economic management is often worse than having no resources at all. Venezuela serves as a powerful reminder that too much money spent incorrectly through corruption, ideology, and economic ignorance can produce worse outcomes than having no money at all, and that natural resource wealth becomes a curse rather than blessing when it enables bad governance rather than promoting sound economic policies. If you found this analysis of Venezuela's economic collapse fascinating, make sure to subscribe to Economic Rewind and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into economic history and the intersection of politics and prosperity. What other examples of resource curse economics would you like us to examine? Let me know in the comments below.